and tries to explore the full set of implications those have. Price theory, on the other hand, tries to look at complex, large numbers of individuals and people and try to think about the simple quantities that characterize those. And that's very useful when you're trying to engineer the way that a market involving large numbers of individuals works. So market design is a field that tries to really set up markets in the real world. And while I think game theory can give us some useful inspirations for that, when you're actually trying to engineer a market that will work in the real world, you have to think about all the complexities that come up in the real world and try to reduce those down to some simple set of statistics, usually called prices. And that's what price theory does. So what we're going to do in this course is we're going to take these classical ideas of price theory, of trying to condense things down to some simple set of ideas, and apply them to engineering the behavior of complex real-world markets. Okay, so in the class today, I'm going to go over a few things. First, I'll talk about the logistics for the course. Second, I'll talk about the NPR report that I had you guys listen to in preparation for the course, and some philosophy of science issues related to what we do as economists. And then I'll give you a summary of what we'll do during the rest of the course. Okay. So this is a joint graduate-undergraduate course, and it isn't going to use the math or specialization that you would get in a graduate course. That's the reason why it's still appropriate for undergraduates. But in some ways it will be harder even than most graduate courses because it's going to demand a lot from you in terms of creative economic thinking. It will ask you to step further outside of the box than even most graduate courses, which will give you a more guided, mathematical, clearly defined problem would do. Okay. So for undergraduates, this may be different as well from other classes for several reasons. So starting today, I will begin cold calling on students to respond to various questions. I will force you to learn a lot of the ideas in the course by exploration rather than just by receiving them from me. So not everything in this course will be spoon-fed to you, and a lot of the problem sets will riff on but not be directly derivable from what we did in class, and will force you to learn by actually exploring the concept. This will be familiar to people who've taken the price theory course, but most of you haven't. It won't be quite as unstructured as the price theory problem sets, but it will be at least as ambitious, and almost all of the problem sets will be things that actually lead into potential research topics. So I've at least tried that on every problem set there's a paper there to potentially write if you wanted to go and do that. The problem sets will be very long, hard, and open-ended. Don't spend forever on them. Most people will not complete most of the problem sets. You should just focus on getting through as much as you can on the things that most interest you or you think you're best at doing, and not trying to do something on all of it. As a result of that, scores in this class will be much lower than in other classes you've taken, but they will also be heavily curved, more generously than the curving in most classes you've taken. So the final distribution of grades will probably be higher than what you're used to at Chicago, even though the scores will be lower. Okay. The other thing is I really want to get to know all of you guys and to really engage with you, so I hope you'll come to office hours, to the TA's office hours, and really engage with this class in a very serious way. Don't be too terrified about cold calling. The goal of it is to get not just the smarty pants to talk, so that I have some sense of why, where people actually are in the class. Okay. So there's a sister course to this class, which is Econ 20110, which is Intermediate Micro Honors. That's worth you knowing for a few reasons. It will cover a lot of the same material as this course, but at a lower level. And their problem sets and exams will riff off of your problem sets and exams. And this will make their material useful for your review, because it will sort of be, giving you back some of the same concepts you've been working on. It will also be useful if you have trouble following this class to listen to their lectures, because it will repeat some of the material at an easier level. Also, if you're struggling with this class but still want to take... Ooh, what happened to this thing? Has it been up at all this whole time I've been talking? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. The slides are online. Okay, so if you're having trouble with this class and you still want to be in one of my classes, but you think that this is a little bit too challenging, you could always drop down to that. I know it's an intermediate class, but it actually has a wide range of different people taking it. So there are law students taking it, students from the Graham School, from the Ed School, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an option. There's also a large bank of old problem sets that you can use to review, far more than you'll ever be able to solve, actually. So all of the old versions of this class have completely different problem sets. Every year I come up with a new set of problem sets that could be the basis of potential papers and so forth. So plenty of material to help you study. All the lectures will be online on my YouTube channel, Prof. Glenn Weil. They'll also be on iTunes U and whatever else Mike, who's our filmographer back there, manages to get them on, such as Coursera and so forth. There are also versions of previous lectures, so there's lots of stuff to help you master the material in the class. Okay. So the course website is up on Chalk. You can also find most of the materials on my personal teaching website on my homepage. The required readings and additional references are on the syllabus. You should complete all the required readings before you come to class, because I will be cold calling. If the references, which are quite extensive, are not enough for you, I also have some enrichment reading that I'm happy to give out, but I think intimidated people when I just posted it up there, so I'm not going to do that. There's no textbook for the course, but we will use Gary Becker's economic theory book, some. All other readings will be on the website. I think even the selections from the Becker book are on the website, but you may prefer reading them in a physical copy. Some references will be on reserve at the library, and you can reach me at my phone in my office or on email. My office hours are Wednesday 4 to 6 p.m. in Rosenwald 205B, and you may miss half of my office hours because one of the sections is during them. But if you can't make the office hours times I have, just let me know and I'll find a time to meet with you. Okay. So because of the large enrollment, this class has two sections. One will be taught by Sam Huang, and that will be the one that's Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. in Stewart 101. His telephone number is given here. His office hours will be on Friday in Stewart Cafe from 9:30 to 11:30. Mohammed Moravej is the other TA. He can be reached at this email and that telephone. His section is from 4:30 to 5:30 on Thursdays in Stewart. That's right, 101. That's right here, right after class. There's not going to be any section this first week. His office hours are, I think this is right, Thursday 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. It might be Friday. You should check on the syllabus just to make sure. You can attend either section or both, but make sure you attend one, because that will be part of participation grade. There will also be, to start the course off in a fun way, hopefully, a movie screening tomorrow from 6:30 to 8:30. It will be catered by the Fat Shallot. I don't know if any of you guys have ever had that, but it's my favorite food truck. The food truck will come up at about 5:45 tomorrow evening on 59th Street, right in front of the Social Sciences building. They do prepare everything fresh, so if you get there early, you won't have to wait in as much of a line. And if you are waiting in line, or if you're waiting to get your food after you've already placed an order, try to come back in and watch as much of the movie as you can, because it is relevant to the course and we will be using it. Okay, the movie's called Margin Call. I don't know if anyone's seen that. It's a very good movie from a few years ago. Make sure to bring your student ID, because we want to make sure people aren't just free riding off of the food, and so we will give lists to them, and they'll check you off as you order. And everyone, by the way, can have one sandwich, one side, and a drink. Okay, so the graded requirements of things you have to do for this course are participation, based on the cold calls and other questions that you ask in class, as well as your participation in the TA sessions. 6 problem sets that will be due at the beginning of the relevant lecture. Please work together on those, but list your partners. The midterm will be a take-home the weekend of November 2nd to the 3rd, but I think that's actually wrong. I think it's actually 4th to the 5th. I'm not completely sure. Check the syllabus. I think I made a mistake up here. All exams are open everything, but no collaboration is allowed on the exams. The take-home, the final is also a take-home. Again, verify this date that I got it right, but I think it's December 7th to the 8th. There will also be a 10-page, roughly, proposal for a research paper due on December 14th. Now, grading differs for the undergraduates and graduates. For undergraduate students must do both the final and the proposal, and these are the distributions across the different things of grading. Undergraduates can do either the proposal or the exam, or if they want, they can do both and then take the best of the 2 grades. And these are the distributions across things. Yeah.
I assume that.
What's your name?
I'm Luke Schmerl.
Luke. Okay.
I assume we can't double count our BA proposal and this 10-page research proposal or research paper proposal.
If your BA proposal is relevant to this class, I have no objection to you doing that.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, the basic requirement for this proposal is it really has to be a serious research proposal. In other words, like, I have to believe that something coming out of what you're proposing would be publishable in a journal. That is basically the standard on which you will be graded. So unless you're capable of doing that, you're likely to do better on the exam. But if you just want to take a shot at it with your BA, that's fine. If your BA is really going to be something that could be a publishable paper, that's great, I'm not sure that that's going to be true for that many people, but it might be, So, and I'd look forward to seeing it. Okay, so any logistical questions before I move on to talking about the actual material? Okay. So I wanted to try to launch the class by giving you an example that I found powerful of how economic analysis can change the way that you look at the world. And I was recently listening to NPR, and I heard this report on drug markets that almost made me cry, because I thought that it so powerfully conveyed the way in which economic analysis can almost be like poetry. It can sort of make you see the world in a totally different way, and I thought it really poignantly brought that through, so I decided to make that sort of the launching point for the course. So I assigned it to you for that reason. It shows, which I think is sort of a key thing about economics, about the power of economic analysis, how there can be hidden forces that are really organizing society in a way that's totally different from the way in which it's conceptualized by the people who participate in that activity. This is, Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand, but it's not just an invisible hand that always leads things to be efficient, as you'll see in this example. It's really just that there are these economic forces that organize how the machine of society works, which is very different than the way that individual people like us, the cogs in that machine, might think we're behaving. Okay. So in particular, it takes sort of a natural dichotomy of like cops versus robbers, and it looks at it from an economic perspective, and I think it gives a very persuasive argument that the standard cops and robbers way of thinking about it is sort of missing most of what's going on. And I think it does this pretty skillfully by actually using the tools that we're going to develop in the course of this class. So I think it shows you what's so powerful about what we'll do during the class. Okay, so Francisco Simeon? Is Francisco here? No. Does anyone else want to say what the basic argument of the report was? Yeah, oh, hey. How's it going, Connor? You cut your hair. That's crazy. Yeah.
So by making medicinal marijuana available in California, it makes it harder for drug dealers in California. It makes it easier for drug dealers, for instance, in New York. That's roughly right. And the way that works is he says that basically some people are particularly good at selling in illegal markets. When legal competition comes in, they are harmed. And without these illegal people, the police would have nothing to do. And as a result, legalization ends up redistributing from people who are good at selling in illegal markets and the police to efficient manufacturers who sell in legal markets. And this actually spurs people to migrate as a result of that. And as a result, we sort of learn that two people who seem to be enemies of each other, the cops and the robbers, are actually each other's best friends. Okay, so the Planet Money makes this argument in several steps. First, it argues that legalization hurts those who are currently selling illegally. And Tyler, is Tyler here? Yeah, Tyler, how does that work?
Well, when it gets legalized, then new, firms, if you will, can enter the market and start selling. So when there's the burst of production, then prices go down. Yeah. And the people who were previously selling marijuana were really adapted to an environment of high cost where they earned a margin selling a small amount, not to low cost, large scale production. And as a result, they do much worse in a market that becomes much more transparent, low cost, etc. Okay. So, second, it argues that legalizing marijuana in California actually makes marijuana more widely available in New York. And there are two reasons that it gives for that. Is Chuyang Wu here? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Chuyang? No? Not here? Okay. Does somebody else want to explain that? Yeah, what's your name?
Arvid.
Arvid.
First, it increases the supply because it's now easier to grow marijuana in California. And second, illegal drug dealers with their skills can now move to New York, creating a better supply there as well.
That's right. So both manpower and land are brought to bear on the supply to New York more easily. Okay. The next thing that it argues is that illegal markets increase the value of having a personal reputation or brand relative to what happens in legal markets. And John Fallon? Yeah. Why is that?
Because people are less willing to look around because they don't want to be caught looking for marijuana.
Yeah, that's right. And also because there's no one to enforce the contracts that you sign, and so you need to use reputation to enforce those. People are afraid they're going to be ripped off, ratted out, otherwise screwed by the person that they're dealing with, right? And so it's very important that they have a long-term personal relationship. The scarcity avoids commoditization, etc. Okay. The fourth thing that it argues is that
the invisible hand of the market guides people to behave and to have effects that are very different than the way that they conceptualize themselves. Is Matthew here? Matthew Moe? Oh, hey Matthew. Do you prefer Matt or Matthew?
Matt's fine.
Matt's fine. Okay. So could how is that? What's some example of that happening in this story?
The drug dealer is following his own economic interest, trying to keep prices high so he can make a larger profit margin.
Yeah. Yeah. But how does he think of what he's doing differently than the way that is the actual social function that he's ends up serving? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Could you repeat the question?
So how does he conceptualize his role or think of himself or have an ideology or a self-image or a vision that's different than the role that the article or the report ends up arguing that he serves?
The drug dealer might think that he's actually doing something good or like adding value to the economy, whereas the report kind of says otherwise.
Does anyone else want to build on that? Does anyone else have thoughts about that? What's your name? Bonnie.
I guess I think that applied more with the case of COP, where the is doing a service for society.
Yeah.
It's actually reducing the drug dealers' competition.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the cop had this image of himself as trying to reduce drugs, keep drugs out, but in reality he was actually the person who probably benefited most was this drug dealer from what he was doing. Similarly, the drug dealer views himself as being this friendly neighborhood guy who has these sort of a hipster. He has these like really nice relationships. He's farm to table. The same way that people in Wicker Park always sell their food, right? And why was he doing that? He thought of himself as having that as like an ideology, this like locally grown whatever. And we as economists look at that and say, well, no, he had that ideology because that allowed him to solve the commitment problem of dealing with the asymmetric information that would otherwise exist. So he had to create this image that he was really loyal to his customers, that he really believed in all this, friendly service, so that his customers could trust him, so that they could solve the asymmetric information problem in the market. So I thought that was an interesting element. So I thought this was a beautiful story, sort of showing how economic forces lie beneath the things we see in the world every day. But a natural question is, what implications does this have for policy? Is David Wilson here? Yeah, David, what implications do you think it has for policy?
I guess I didn't read this, but I would guess legalization would reduce prices. I guess there wouldn't be as much of a need for kind of I'm not sure.
Does anyone else have thoughts about policy implications of this sort of analysis? Yeah, Vidar.
It suggests that legalization could decrease the cost of policing and maybe remove the more dangerous kind of violent drug dealers in California.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some of that. That's a more traditional analysis, but I thought there's actually some quite untraditional things here. In particular, I think it pointed out that there could be spillovers from one state to another. So if one state legalizes marijuana, that might increase the supply in another state and undermine their efforts to control marijuana consumption. Second, it points out, and this I thought was very true from my experience, that the most important constituency against marijuana legalization is actually not the parents who don't want their kids smoking pot, but rather the drug dealers who don't want the competition. So I know some people who are involved in the illegal drug business, formerly illegal drug business in California, and they were implacably opposed to the attempts to legalize marijuana in California because they knew that it would completely eliminate their market and that they would be forced to move to other places, right? And perhaps most controversially, it suggests a potential collaboration between the government and illegal drug dealers. Is Jennifer Shaw here? Yeah, Jennifer, why might that be true?
I mean, I also didn't know about the Senate.
I see.
But,
Sorry.
But I guess that would be because, like, in this case, making marijuana legal hurts those who are dealing with illegal markets. So it seems like the incentives of criminals and government are kind of.
Yeah. So how might a criminal help the government achieve its goal of reducing marijuana consumption? Does anyone else have thoughts about that? Yeah, Charlie.
The state could pay the criminal to keep sales down.
Yeah, would the state even have to pay the criminal to do that? What's your name?
Ari.
Ari.
Police, right? Like just peer pressure them almost like to keep sales down so they don't get in trouble.
I'm trying to think of a reason why the criminal would actually want themselves to keep it down and why the government would want to help the criminal achieve their goals. Does anyone have thoughts about that? Hey, what's your name?
Daye.
Daye.
Just make them cooperate together to set the price high.
Yeah, exactly. How do you spell your name?
Daye.
Daye. Yeah, so basically, these illegal guys, they're monopolists. Monopolists' main goal is not to produce. It's to keep other people from producing. It's to reduce the supply. Pablo Escobar in Colombia spent most of his time blowing up other people's cocaine factories, not manufacturing cocaine. He was the best ally of the anti-drug consumption people in the United States. As soon as they killed Pablo Escobar, the price of cocaine plummeted in the United States because there was much closer to free competition in Colombia to provide cocaine. So actually, there's a very natural alliance of interests between a government trying to reduce production and illegal producers trying to keep up monopoly prices. Yeah, what's your name? Sorry?
Zefeng.
Yep.
Yeah, what the illegal stuff producers will like worry about if the government kills everybody else, and the government will catch the guys work with the government, the criminals work with the government. So I think the criminals will still worry about working with the state.
Well, in the case of Pablo Escobar, they ended up having to kill him not because he was like increasing cocaine production, but because he became so powerful because he was the only producer that they were afraid he was going to take over the Colombian government. He was like running for president, and he had so much money he was able to like buy all the politicians and so forth. So the opposite thing can happen as well. So I agree with that. But the thing that you're saying, there's a great historical example of that. So when Hitler came to power in Germany, there's this famous Protestant preacher. Does anyone know his name? The guy, I think he won the Nobel Prize.
I think you misunderstand me.
No, I understand what you're saying. I'm going to tell a story about it. Tell me if I'm wrong that I misunderstand what you're saying. Okay. So what happened with this preacher was that he said, I wasn't a Jew, so when Hitler came for the Jews, I didn't complain. I wasn't a communist, so when Hitler came for the communists, I didn't complain. I wasn't a socialist, so when he came for the socialists, I didn't complain. I wasn't a Catholic, so when he came for the Catholics, I didn't complain. And then when I was the only person left for him to come from, then there was no one to complain for me.
Yeah.
That's the problem that you're worried about. No, that's true. But I think that it goes both ways. The government might worry if they eliminate all the other criminals, then there will be no criminal to compete with the last criminal that's left. And that's the reason that they had to go for Pablo Escobar. So it cuts two ways. So I think that there's some amount of that going on as well. But I also think the basic dynamic of the alignment of their interests makes sense. So, yeah, Arvid.
Like, since there's substantial interest and a lot of money involved,
yeah.
Would you get like more bribes? I mean, to maintain that almost monopoly?
That's another concern, is that if you know that a monopoly is going to be established, there might be a lot of violence in the interim to put yourself in the dominant position to then. So that's another concern, is that a lot of the profits that a monopoly makes are dissipated through violence. So there might be a trade-off between having a higher price and having more violence, right? So that might be a disagreement of those interests. And I think we've seen a little bit of that in Mexico, that the U.S. Really wants to keep prices high to reduce consumption. But those high prices create a lot of violence in Mexico to compete for those rents. Right? So there's a trade-off between the producer area and the consumer area. Okay, so in this, and in fact, one interesting thing that comes out of that is that if you look at the way that monopoly profits work, you get, like, when you start to raise prices above cost, you initially get a lot of profit, but only a little bit of rise in price. And as you get towards monopoly, the profit doesn't rise much at all, but you get a large, for the same increase of price, because you're getting towards like the monopolist's optimal price. So given that you have these two objectives, you might want to have either monopoly or perfect competition, but not anything in between. Because in between you get both some violence and some, like, and not that much increase in price. So yeah, so I wrote up something that was sort of about that. Anyway, so for this class, my hope is that you're going to learn a bunch of tools that are going to be useful in producing analyses of what's going on in various situations like this. So in lecture 3, we're going to talk a lot about the importance of heterogeneity in ability and how that creates rents that might be affected by this sort of competition. We'll talk about comparative advantage and how people sort into the things that they're best at doing, like being in an illegal market in this case. We'll talk about how markets can fail with asymmetric information and how to address that. We'll talk about the design of products and branding, advertising, how that plays a role in overcoming adverse selection problems. We'll talk about the surprising effects of incidence when there's heterogeneity in lecture 11. We'll talk about ideologies and how they might serve some role that's, even if people don't believe or don't understand their true role within an economic system, why it might make sense for them to have some narrow ideological view of what they're doing, like we saw in this. And we'll talk, that'll be a subject in the first problem set. And hopefully, as you go throughout the course and learn more concepts, you'll see more and more economic ideas in this simple little story. Okay, so I think that this is exciting and powerful, but the question is it really science? And I think that Hilary Putnam's article helps us reflect a little bit on this. So Hilary Putnam, in this article, was in dialogue with 3 different views of what science is and does. Is Moon-Soo Kang here?
Yeah.
Is that the right way to pronounce your name? Moon-Soo?
Yeah.
Okay. What?
No.
Yeah. So what were the 3 views of science that Putnam was discussing?
Sorry.
You didn't read the piece? Okay. Did anyone else read the piece and could describe Putnam's 3 views of science? Yeah. Go ahead, Lancelot.
I'm not sure of 3 views, but I know she discussed Karl Popper's view.
Yeah, that's one of the 3. Yeah.
Okay, and Thomas Kuhn's view. Thomas Kuhn's view.
Thomas Kuhn's view, and there was a 3rd view.
Is it her own view?
You know, it's inductivist. It's him, but yes. I know Hillary is usually a woman's name nowadays, but it used to be a bisex name. So, yeah. No, he discusses a 3rd one, which is in the inductivist view. So, can anyone, Sunamika? Is Sunamika here? Do you know what's the inductivist view of science?
I think it's when you go from the fact and then from there try to find the theory or
Yep. So that's right. That's the basic inductivist idea. In particular, he identifies it with the sort of view of the philosophy of science that you guys probably learned in middle school. So it's like, come up with a hypothesis based on looking at stuff, test the hypothesis. If it's wrong, maybe downweight the amount of that hypothesis. If it's right, upweight it, build new hypotheses off that, et cetera, right? That's like the quote-unquote scientific method that you probably learned in school, right? Now, what was Popper's argument about this traditional scientific method? Is Orlando here? Yeah.
I guess like the theories that inductivists put forth, they say that they're confirmed, but what Popper says is they're more you could only say that they're corroborated. they're highly supported, so they're not necessarily true. There's just lots of evidence to support each theory.
Yeah, that's right. He says something even stronger than that, which he says there's not even any evidence in their favor. All that you're allowed to say is that a theory that was wrong is wrong. You can't even say that a theory that was right was right. It just was not wrong. That's what Popper argues. Yeah, did you have a question? No. And so all we do is maintain theories that have not been proven false. We don't prove that theories are correct. Now, is Felipe Hayakawa here? Yeah. Felipe, why, what's Kuhn's view of science?
I also covered it.
I see. Did anyone else remember Kuhn's view? Yeah, Jack.
So Kuhn says science, the evolution of science basically is the evolution of paradigms. So
Yeah.
a paradigm is just like a dominant theory and some surprising findings from that theory,
Yeah.
surprising predictions that it makes.
Yeah.
And scientists themselves as humans tend to come into this paradigm, do their daily work in this paradigm,
Yeah.
and then we only see major shifts when the basic theory of the paradigm is wrong or there's surprising new data.
Yeah.
And that's what has to come through generational change rather than just the scientific.
Yeah, that's right. So he basically thinks theories are unfalsifiable. There's no way to even prove a theory wrong. That normal science is not about testing theories. Science is about showing that the world is consistent with theories. And that what normal scientists do is just come up with additional ad hoc explanations, basically, to make the world fit the theory, not to make the theory fit the world. And that there's really no criterion for comparing theories. That they're really just different languages for discussing the same world. Just like you couldn't prove Spanish is wrong and English is right, you can't prove that Newtonian mechanics is wrong and relativity is right. And that scientific revolutions really come with generational change, when a new generation comes to embrace a new theory. Now, what Putnam tries to do is he tries to take Kuhn's view, which obviously sounds radically subjectivist. It sounds like anything goes, really, and tries to give it a little bit more objective meaning, but still basically agrees with it. Yeah.
You say
Yeah,
that
Arvid.
they're not comparable, but
Yeah.
isn't that also that she makes a
Yeah.
point that you can still, like, based on the amount of auxiliary statements and the predictive power and the success, like Jack said?
Well, yeah. So Putnam is going to argue that, but that's not what Kuhn argues, really.
Oh.
So Kuhn has this radically subjectivist view, and then Putnam is going to try to take Kuhn's ideas and make them more objectivist or more sort of progressivist, like science is actually making progress and so forth. Okay, so first Putnam tries to dismiss Popper's position as compared to the inductivists. In particular, he says that it's ludicrous to say that a theory isn't true just because we have only failed to reject it multiple times. Because in reality, all the time in the real world, we're making choices about, like, making decisions. And to make decisions, we need a theory, right? And in order to, what are we going to do? Just not make decisions based on the theory that has failed to be rejected, right? I mean, that just seems crazy, right? And so any theory that survives has to have actually gained people's belief and not just failed to be rejected. However, the main critique that Putnam makes is not of Popper as such, but of the whole view that Popper shares with the inductivists. That is, that theories can be tested. In that sense, he's like Kuhn. And in particular, he thinks that even the best theories on their own imply nothing that can be tested. Quite a radical view, right? So, is Claire Len here? Yeah, Claire, could you explain why he thinks that the universal theory of gravitation on its own can't be tested? Or why it was never tested? You didn't read it. Does someone else want to try to explain that?
Can you read the question?
So he gives an example of the universal theory of gravitation. And he says that it's never been tested. Or that it was really, or that, it came to be widely accepted without ever being tested. And he tries to explain that in some detail. Can someone explain that? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to guess because they're talking about planets.
So your name again is Ari, right?
Ari, yeah. Talking about planets, you can't really test things. I mean, you can observe planets, but you can't manipulate them.
Yeah, it's a little bit related to that. I mean, that's certainly one reason why it can't be tested. Like, there's clearly no experimental thing. All you can do is ex post explain stuff. So that's certainly a sense in which it's not really a falsifiable theory, right? But he gives something even stronger that I think gives a real clear sense of why theories can't be tested. Yeah, what's your name again?
My name's Robert.
Robert, yep.
So basically, like, the theory was created to explain the observations and calculations, and this paradigm was created, and it was that language. So,
yeah.
I mean, really, it was made to explain this stuff. You can't test it with something else.
Yeah, that's related to Ari's point. But he gives an example with Uranus that I think is particularly compelling. Does anyone remember this? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, remind me of your name. Daia?
Did he say that when you have an anomaly that you can't really reject the theory itself, but you have to reconsider the kind of auxiliary statements that
Yeah, so he gives this example of Uranus, which is that we noticed that there were, I forget which planet it was, but one planet wasn't following the orbit that we thought it should follow. So if you wanted to be really naive, you would say that rejects the theory of gravitation. The gravitation predicted that it should follow this path. It doesn't follow this path, right? I mean, if you were really proper, that's what you would have to say. But that's not what people did. People said, oh gosh, it doesn't follow the path that it should follow. Maybe, actually, there's another planet out there, right? And that planet is exerting some extra gravity and causing it to do it. So they actually posited where would the planet have to be in order to cause Uranus to follow this other path, right? And that's how they discovered Neptune or something like that, right? So that just shows how absurd it is to think of falsifying a theory. Because the whole way you discover things is actually by trying to explain what doesn't make sense under a theory. You don't view that as a falsification of the theory, right? And in particular, in order to make any prediction based on gravity, you need these things that Daia, is that how you pronounce it? Daia was alluding to. You can't just say it's the theory of gravitation. There's all these additional assumptions and statements you need to make, called what he calls ancillary statements. And these assumptions are not only not part of the theory, but they're completely false. They're ludicrous, these statements. They're statements like the only force is gravitation. The only thing that exists is the sun and whatever planet you're trying to predict the motion of. That everything exists in a vacuum, which it clearly doesn't, right? So, and these assumptions are needed in order for the theory to make any predictions. The theory on its own makes no predictions. And so we know that all the things we're using to make predictions are wrong. So you could never prove the theory wrong, because you can always say one of these assumptions are wrong, right? Because we already know that the assumptions are false, right? So of course the theory can't be wrong. You know, you can always point to the assumptions being wrong. So what he says is that that really what leads to theories being supplanted is not that they're wrong or that they're falsified by data, but rather that people are having a hard time or getting annoyed with having to deal with this theory where they can't figure out clever ways to explain things away using the theory, right? So it's really like the practical difficulty of finding solutions under the theory and not the wrongness of the theory that causes it to get supplanted. And that what causes people to be interested in a theory instead is that you're able, using some incredibly simplistic, silly, stupid assumptions, to nonetheless explain how something interesting in the world works if the assumptions sort of seem to fit the essence of some part of what's going on, but of course don't in any sense correspond to the world in which we live. In fact, most of science instead, he argues, is about puzzle solving, which happens in steps. So the most common thing that he says is that you know some fact about the world, and you have a theory, and you try to seek for some simple set of ancillary statements that you can make, which will explain the fact given the theory. This is what Putnam calls his schema 2. The second thing he says that people do is that people know the ancillary statements, and they have the theory, And then they spend a lot of time using mathematics to derive what the predictions are that come from the theory and from the ancillary statements. So a lot of science is not even about anything relating to the world. It's just about deriving the consequences of a given set of assumptions. And this is what Putnam calls the schema 3. And this is purely logical deduction. And this is much of what theory in economics, for example, does. Now the final schema is the one that's most close to Popper's idea of falsification, where you have ancillary statements, you have a theory, and it makes a prediction, and then you go out and test that prediction. That sounds more like an inductivist or Popperian thing, but the point that's key is that when you actually find that false thing, you never view that as a failure of the theory. You always view that as a failure of the explanation or the ancillary statements that you gave that led you to make that prediction. And so the theory really is almost never falsified. It's almost always one of these subsidiary things that are below the broad paradigm that are viewed as being wrong. Yeah.
So Junctus, I didn't read the article. Junctus, if it's
yeah.
Wouldn't the Bayesian sort of thinking kind of invalidate this criticism to a greater or lesser extent?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that it doesn't have to be viewed as a criticism. I think that it has to be viewed as a failure of the simplistic way of thinking about science. And, Bayesianism is great, but Bayesianism really doesn't give you a structure. There's Bayesian ways to write down what Popper said, and there's pretty much. And there's Bayesian ways to write down what he's saying. But I think it really says more about the structure of how science works, that there's these broad level theories, and then there's more specific theories, and you have to layer on assumption after assumption after false assumption as an imperfect approximation to the world, and that those are the objects that we're really learning about from a Bayesian sense. And I think it's very true. It's really, if you've ever been a scientist, you realize that that's the case. And what Kuhn does so compellingly is he goes to the history of science, and like Putnam does, and he gives lots of examples that I think really show you how that works. Sorry, what's your name again? Luke. Yeah, great. Yeah.
But isn't there a sense in which you have a paradigm?
Yeah.
And then you come up with more and more ad hoc explanations, to reconcile the paradigm with what you want
yeah.
to world. But at some point when you have to come up with more and more ad hoc explanations, that's when you get a new paradigm.
Yeah, so I
sort of not falsify a theory in the Popper sense, but there is still a point at which...
No, I think there is something in the objective world that's pushing back against you, which is that it's getting complicated or hard. But it could be that it's just hard for you to come up with the explanations, and they seem ad hoc, and there could be floating out there the thing that fits perfectly with this theory, and the theory could actually be right. And in fact, that's happened many times. So the Greeks had an atomic theory, but they didn't have the right language for developing that. So people abandoned the atomic theory, and they went to another theory that was less good than the atomic theory, but they just couldn't come up with the right way of explaining what atoms were. You know what I mean? So, that happens all the time throughout history, actually.
But it also happened with, people thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And with such a model, it could actually explain perfectly, every...
exactly, but the things were complicated.
But it was getting more and more complicated.
Yeah.
That's how we go to...
Exactly. Exactly.
So...
What's your name?
Oliver.
What? Oliver? Yep.
So, surely the important question which you think we've missed here is
Yeah.
not, is theory X correct, but rather, is theory X or theory Y a better approximation to the real world? Surely any theory of science must look at comparing theories rather than validating.
Well, and I think that's very much part of the Putnam and Kuhn view of the world, that it takes a theory to beat a theory. That really what is attractive is an alternative paradigm in which to work, not whether a theory is right or not. And that was a big thing that was wrong with both the Popper, especially the Popper view, and also the inductivist view of things. You have a door.
Isn't that the pure distillation of what Kuhn was saying? That you have a theory up until the point it's defeated by some other...
Exactly. Up until the point at which the other thing becomes a more popular way of doing it. And I guess the way to think about it is think about languages. Languages might be better, it might be more or less awkward to say something in some language, and you might learn another language just because this language is so awkward in which to talk about something. But it's almost its practical usefulness in expressing certain types of things rather than its like absolute truth. There's much more of a spectrum between what we would call a language or a humanistic sort of thing and a scientific theory. That's what I thought was really interesting about this. Okay, so the successes of theories, what really convinces us of them, is that they have cute solutions to puzzles. So, in the example that I was giving earlier, the one from NPR, right? The thing that I thought was so compelling about economics there is here was this like mystery. Why had this guy migrated out when there had been legalization? And economics has this very cute explanation of what's going on, right? And what convinces you, what should make you attracted to economics as a way of talking about things, is that it's able to give this simple, cute explanation of something that we see in the world. It's not that it has a falsifiable prediction in that context. It's that you're able to use the economic language of economics to say something cute, maybe even beautiful, about what's going on in the world. And so I think that Putnam's view really both rebuts the purely subjectivist view of Kuhn, because it does show that there is something in the world that determines what you're able to make fit or not make fit. But at the same time, it's not like the Popper or the inductivists think, where there's like falsification and true or false theories exactly. Okay. So what I take from this is that theories are really like languages. And like languages, there are some things that are easy to say in a language. That is, there's lots of simple ancillary statements that explain a fact. And there's some things that are hard to say in a language. I think we all know, if you're bilingual, that certain concepts are really easy to convey in English and hard to convey in other languages, and vice versa. And I think theories are very much like that as well. So really the value of a theory is that it makes some things easy to talk about, and other things, maybe less relevant things, or things that are less relevant in its desired context, harder to explain. And so really teaching a theory is about working through examples, showing people how you speak in the language of that theory. And these are not really just applications, but they're really the language itself. If you just learn the grammar and the words in French, you would really not know French at all, right? You have to actually speak French. You have to actually read the literature in order to be able to understand the language. And in the same way, economics is not just a formal set of propositions, but an illustration of the way in which those propositions make contact with the world in which we live. And so falsifiability really, to me, just means that it's easier to say some things in a language than it is to say others. That means the language puts emphasis. It highlights certain aspects of the world. A non-falsifiable theory is one that's so vague where you don't even know how it interacts with the world. So in reality, it's actually even more complicated than this, because a theory is really something very broad, but then there are sort of sub-theories. So if economics is a theory, then within economics, there's the theory of industrial organization, there's the theory of corporate finance, that are more refined, more specific languages that draw on different aspects of things to help you say things about the real world. And in this class, you're going to learn the language of economics, and you're going to learn some of the specific theories, the sub-theories, the dialects within economics that let you speak about particular things more strongly than about others. Okay, so I'm going to take you through all both the broad language of economics now that we're going to learn to speak together, as well as some of the dialects. Okay, now Becker articulates this idea quite boldly and unapologetically in the piece that I asked you to read of his about the economic approach to human behavior. So he says that in the economic approach to human behavior, individuals are thought to maximize stable preferences. Those preferences tend to be over objects that are pretty universal across all people and don't vary from time to place or person to person. And that those we derive from psychology, sociology, biology, but not internally from economics. that all constraints are interpreted as some form of price or opportunity cost, that technology and markets and information are thought to shape these constraints that exist on human behavior. And that is where really hard science contributes to economics, because things like computers, communications technologies tell us about what type of information we have. The technology of production is determined by the scientific constraints. Like, for example, one of my friends was recently designing an auction of spectrum, and he had to think about the way in which different frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum do or do not interfere with each other in different uses, because that will help determine what allocations are possible, and therefore, what is the best design of the system. And that economics, in particular price theory, which is what we'll study in this class, focuses on the behavior of aggregates of large numbers of individuals. Game theory, which you guys have probably also learned in other contexts, focuses primarily on how small numbers of individuals interact with each other and looks at all the possible things that can emerge from that. Whereas price theory looks at very complicated systems, big markets, and discusses how those can be simplified down to some simple summaries of what's going on. So, for example, if you think about thermodynamics versus quantum mechanics looks at very simple systems. There's a few atoms, and it looks at all the potential things that can come out of that. And that's what led us to think about nuclear bombs and most of these big breakthroughs in terms of how we what we even look at in physics. But if you actually want to build a nuclear bomb, you need to not just think about a simple interaction between a couple of particles, which came out of quantum mechanics, but how when you put large numbers of things together, they behave on average. And that's really what price theory does. If game theory gives you inspirations about different mechanisms that could occur, price theory is the field that looks at how when there's large numbers of things in a complicated system, you can take a simple essence out of that to achieve a policy goal. And economists tend to de-emphasize the role of luck, changes in preference, consumer confusion, lack of understanding. And that's just not a key part of the language of economics most of the time. Okay, so this is not the only approach, nor do I think it's necessarily the best approach to thinking about the organization of social, of societies, but I hope that you'll find that it's a useful discipline on your thinking, that it provides a powerful baseline for framing difficult problems that we face as a society, and that it provides a fruitful language for analyzing many problems that you would traditionally think of as economic, but also other problems that you might not traditionally think of in the economic terms. And Becker tries to emphasize particularly this, some areas where economics has something to say that would not necessarily be the way that you would have thought about it otherwise. So on health, is Ezra here? No? Does anyone else want to say what Becker says about health that's sort of a little bit different than how a non-economist might think about the problem? Remind me again? Miles, yeah.
So it turns into an actual choice of, given your constraints and what your job is and how much money you have or how much you want to invest in your health.
Yes.
Make a decision based off that, how healthy you want to be.
Exactly. So he says all death is in some sense a suicide, because there's always a way that at very high cost you could have prolonged your life a bit longer. Every day we make all sorts of choices that shorten or lengthen our life, and we trade those off against other things. So the idea of just saying, my health is the most important, that's not how we actually live in the real world. And that all sorts of things, wages, education, aging, other things that we think of as usually affecting preferences, but are really things that impact what we're going to choose in our lives, will affect how long we live as well, not just because they directly affect our health, but because they affect the choices that we make. Becker also talks about marriage in these terms, which is quite interesting and controversial. Is Matthew Lee here? Yeah. Do you go by Matt, Matthew?
Matt.
Okay, Matt. Okay, cool.
He talks about how expected from marrying someone that's higher than people will marry, and then it's the opposite for people trying to divorce. There's like a market for marriage.
Yeah, that's right. And in particular, he talks about how it's really a competitive market where everyone's trying to get the best match that they can, given the other competition and so forth. So, if more women come to a school, then there will be, basically the average man that each woman gets will go down, and that, and so forth. And you guys probably maybe don't think about things in exactly those terms, but I think you'll find it's actually quite a fruitful exercise if you try to think about marriage as being a market. He also says that people will get sorted positively on things that are complementary between the two of them, but negatively on things that are substitutable. So two educated people will tend to match with each other because they get value out of talking about ideas with each other that they might be unable to talk to someone who's less educated with. But on the other hand, someone who is wealthy might get matched with someone who's poor because money is concave, you have concave utility of consumption, and so conditional on education, you might expect people who are wealthy to match with people who are poor. Okay. Another area like this is ideas, and in fact, I've been doing some work on this recently. So, we like to think of ourselves in the academy as just we think about whatever we want to think about, we're interested in whatever we're interested in, etc. But Becker argues that material incentives will affect what people in academia choose to work on. So I have a project right now which is about comparing the fields of industrial organization and finance. And in that paper I argue that financial economics is mostly focused on how do you make the most money in the markets or predict where stock prices are going, because there's a lot of opportunity to make money doing that in consulting work. Whereas industrial organization is mostly focused on what's good for society and what would be good policy and what are things that should or should not be illegal under the antitrust laws, because there's a lot of opportunity to consult on antitrust cases and to help persuade the competition authorities that a company should or should not go to jail or be fined for something that they did. And because there's all those consulting opportunities in that area, that's what everyone works on within industrial organization. So ideas too are subject to material incentives. So these, and as well as traditional applications, are all sort of dialects of economics, different areas where economists have developed their ideas and ways of talking about things within the broad perspective of goal-directed, incentive-influenced action. Okay, so let me briefly run through what we're going to do for the rest of the class to develop some of these dialects. So Thursday and on Tuesday we'll talk about firms, about what a firm is, what firms should maximize, how do internal conflicts interfere with firms' attempts to maximize their profits, supply curves over different temporal durations, how temporal durations interact with the nature of the factors firms use to produce, and we'll talk about how you can use different length of time static models of equilibrium to think about dynamics. We'll talk about industry supplies, how those are related to entry and to duration, about how scarce talent plays a role in creating people's ability to earn profits, as well as other barriers of entry that can create profits, and about the distribution of talent and ability across society. Then in the next couple of lectures, we'll talk about equilibrium, the existence of equilibrium and how that's related to the size of the market, the correspondence principle, which relates stability of equilibrium to the comparative statics of an equilibrium. We'll talk about income effects and why those might be small, and how that relates to the notion of quasi-linear utility, which we'll use to calculate consumer surplus during much of the course. We'll talk about the incidence of taxation in a competitive equilibrium, and we'll do some applications to international trade. We'll then talk about designing a system for allocating courses to students, which is a recent popular problem in economics. And we'll talk about centralized versus decentralized approaches to doing that. And we'll use that as a way to motivate the distinction between capitalism and communism. And I'll try to argue that actually capitalism and communism, from the perspective of normal economics, are not nearly as different as you think they are. And that in fact, both are applications of underlying basic economic principles that we learn. And that in fact, the principles that you learned, the first fundamental welfare theorem, for example, is not an endorsement of capitalism. That in fact, it might actually be closer to communism in many ways. I'll use that as a lead-in to talk about how important information is to thinking about the distinction between capitalism and communism, and how information technology is leading us increasingly to make centralized, more communistic forms of social organization more attractive. Then I'll talk about externalities and how we should optimally deal with externalities. So I'll talk about what an externality is. I'll compare pecuniary, which are not real externalities, to real externalities. I'll talk about internalities, that is, externalities that could happen from a person hurting themselves. And I'll talk about different policy responses we might make to externalities. Taxation, cap and trade, damages through the legal system. The trade-off between using something like cap and trade or using Pigouvian taxes. I'll talk about the Coase theorem and how important information is to thinking about externalities. I'll then talk about using science and scientific reasoning to assess externalities. And we'll go through an example related to the value of human life and how that affects optimal taxation of carbon. I'll then talk about how when the information that we get just from scientific analyses is not enough, that we have to try to gather information in a dispersed way from the public, maybe using a survey or a contingent valuation survey. But I'll talk about the problems that contingent valuation surveys cause from a strategic perspective. I'll then talk about eliciting information in a way that doesn't create those strategic problems using the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, and why the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism doesn't work as well as you might hope, and some alternatives to the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, in particular the expected externality mechanism. So then I'm going to introduce an analysis of market power. I'll talk about what a monopoly is, what the sources of monopoly power are, the distortion to quantity and pricing caused by monopolies, how you might empirically measure monopoly pricing, and how you think about monopolies when there isn't a concave profit function. I'll talk about measuring the distortion of monopoly, the incidence of taxation under monopoly. You probably know about the incidence of, or we'll talk about the incidence of taxation under competition, but we'll also talk about it under monopoly. I'll talk about problems with regulating monopoly down to marginal cost. I'll talk about average cost regulation as an alternative to marginal cost regulation and how it might be easier to implement. The distortions that sort of regulation, average cost pricing, causes. I'll talk about the relationship between average cost pricing and the distortions caused by adverse selection in markets. And then I'll talk about the empirical measurement of selection and how that relates to the possibility of market collapse and optimal policy in the insurance market, which, as we all have found out over the last few days, is a very complicated and controversial area of public policy recently. Okay, so then we're going to have a midterm exam. And after the midterm exam, we're going to move beyond just a monopolist's choice of the quantity and price to charge. So in particular, we'll talk about why price discrimination fails to solve the monopoly problem, and how a firm might design their products in order to try to overcome some of the problems that their inability to price discriminate causes. We'll talk about Hotelling's model of the design of a product, and we'll relate that to political science and to the choices of newspapers about their political slant. We'll talk a little bit about platforms and the value that users of a product can create for it and how that can be a part of product design. We'll then talk about how product design can be used for sorting. Then we'll turn to price discrimination, in particular view price discrimination as a form of product design. We'll talk about third degree or explicit price discrimination, where I charge different types of people different prices. Second degree or implicit price discrimination, where everyone faces the same menu of options, but I have products of different qualities, or I have products that have I offer different amounts of products for different prices. I then will talk about monopoly as an incentive for firms to get into an industry, the profits that monopoly offers as a way to bring firms into an industry, and about how, in general, the environment depends more on this dynamic process of creation of new products than it does on the static distortions created by monopolies. And we'll relate that to criminal behavior and the economics of crime. And we'll use that to develop Becker's theory of optimal criminal justice, relating that to the optimal design of intellectual property. And we'll talk about the trade-off between intellectual property's static distortions by giving monopoly power and the benefits that it can create by bringing new firms into the industry. And use that to derive some optimal innovation policy, as well as alternative tools to intellectual property instead of IP. Okay, then we're going to turn to so we will have talked about monopoly, we will have talked about competition, but then I want to turn to talking about imperfect forms of competition between firms. So we'll talk about different oligopoly solution concepts, the notion of a conduct parameter as a way of summarizing oligopoly models, the empirical measurement of oligopoly power, the incidence of taxation in the context of oligopoly, and the way in which oligopoly can misallocate resources between firms rather than just reducing or increasing the overall consumption of a good. I'll then talk about selection markets with market power, and in particular whether monopoly power is desirable or not desirable under selection, as well as the way in which firms will try to selectively attract the best consumers away from other firms and the distortions that that can create to the quality of products. We'll then turn to competition policy, which is the standard application of oligopoly theory, and Cournot's theorem, which says how as there gets to be more competition, we get towards the optimal allocation of resources. And we'll talk about some empirical studies of that type of effect, how those are applied in an institutional framework to make policy related to competition in the real world. We'll talk about quantifying the effects of mergers in differentiated products industries and how that's used to, in practice, determine whether a merger should be approved or not. Then, at the end of the course, we're going to put all this stuff together to talk about some big picture social policy issues. We'll start by talking about economic inequality and how this has been a big and growing problem. And we'll talk about some of the classic arguments for why we might want to redistribute wealth to make things more equal. And we'll use utilitarianism as a perspective on that, but we'll also talk about some alternative normative perspectives and use those to study the problem of optimal linear income taxation, the trade-off between, on the one hand, giving a more equal distribution of wealth, but on the other hand, discouraging people too much from working. We'll calibrate that model using data, and then we'll turn to the problem of public goods. So we'll talk about what it means for something to be a public good, the free rider problem with public goods and the need for coercion. We'll talk about democracy and the problem of the tyranny of the majority and why democracy may not be such a great way to make social justice. A great example of that is gay marriage, where, you know, there's about 4% of the population that cares a tremendous amount about the issue, and 96%, you know, maybe they feel one way or the other, but they hardly care. And yet 4% of the people are making almost none of the decision. Most of the decision is made by the other people who can determine whether a majority is in favor or against, which seems really a crazy way to make the decision. And so we'll talk about some of the alternatives to voting and the weaknesses with them. And then I'll propose my own personal alternative to democracy, which is called quadratic voting, or democracy squared. And I'll talk about some of the benefits of quadratic voting in the sense in which it's robust, as well as its applications. And then I'll wrap up the course with a summary.